Hi, Geo for Good. I'm Nithya Sowrirajan, and I'm the Director for Global Solutions for Google Earth and Earth Engine. I'm excited to welcome to our roundtable today 4 partners from influential and ambitious institutions, starting with Luiz Amaral, who is a Director, Global Solutions for Commodities and Finance at WRI, World Resources Institute. WRI is leading the Forest Data Partnership, recently announced at COP26, which you're here to talk about today. Welcome also to Andrew Wilcox, who is the Sustainable Sourcing Manager for Unilever, previously from Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. We're also joined by Karis Tennyson, Director of the Environmental Mapping Domain with Spatial Informatics Group. And finally, Julian Fox, who is a team leader of National Forest Monitoring at FAO. Welcome to our roundtable, everyone. And in true pandemic and virtually progressive fashion, I will tell you that all 5 of us, including me, are in different parts of the world. And so it's really exciting, and I'm really grateful for all of them to make time. So if you're seeing some, backgrounds that look like it's getting late in the day, that's why it is. And we're especially grateful for our partners here for making the time. So let me take a moment before we get started to remind your audience that you are part of this roundtable. You can enter your questions below the video player, and I hope to have enough time to get to them. The more questions I have, the sooner I'll stop talking and you can get your questions answered. We're here today to talk about a novel public-private partnership just announced at COP26 by USAID called the Forest Data Partnership. It was also included in the Biden-Harris administration's plan to conserve global forests, critical carbon sinks, which we're really excited about. Advances in remote sensing, cloud infrastructure, and machine learning are increasing by the day. These technology breakthroughs, combined with private sector commitments, have the potential to drastically transform the way landscapes are monitored and managed. And so to leverage these game-changing technologies, FAO, Google, NASA USAID Surveyor Program, Unilever, USAID and WRI have come together to build an aligned approach. I know that was a whole host of partners and acronyms, but that's why we're here and are excited to have every one of them represented. The Forest Data Partnership will create a consistent geospatial data ecosystem, accelerating collective action to unlock huge potential for emissions reductions and co-benefits to people and nature. So I'm really excited to talk to the people who have created this from the ground up. And because this is so new, I'm going to start with really, really basic questions. So Andrew, let me start with you. I'm really curious, as I'm sure this audience is what really is the vision and driving force behind this initiative? And before you answer, I really am also curious to understand Unilever's role. Obviously, Unilever has made some very solid commitments in this space. They've committed to deforestation-free commodity sourcing. But why is Unilever part of a pioneer part of this partnership? Why is this multilateral partnership important to you sitting here with NGOs and leading international agencies? And if I may ask, if you can start with really simple language, how are you describing this, maybe at dinner with your family?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess before I jump in, just obviously it's so wonderful to be here, and to be here with these partners is just fantastic. Yet another Geo for Good. So the driving force, if I had to summarize, is action. Unilever is one of the leading consumer goods companies. We know that our influence has an impact in the world and our supply chain, and we're completely committed to a deforestation-free supply chain. And we're making progress to achieve that. But we really believe that it's this partnership that will help us to accelerate that, and more importantly, to extend that beyond. And so, thinking about, maybe this will come up at Thanksgiving, and I have to explain it to all my aunts and uncles. It's about, if we want to change something, we have to be able to see it. It goes back to that famous adage, if you can't manage what you can't measure. And in this context, we need to be able to agree as a community of stakeholders where forests are, where they've been, where they're changing, where they could be, where they produce benefits that are critical to people, people living in cities, smallholders, et cetera. And that's really the driving force here. And I know it's an ambition that I share with everyone here. So really exciting to kick this off.
That's great. So with that, maybe I'll go to you, Luiz. What would you say WRI's role is in this FDP, or Forest Data Partnership? And why are all these players, since you're a convener, involved? And how do they complement each other?
Great. Well, again, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to be here discussing that and bringing a little bit of those two words together, right? Our world of implementing changes for the environment and better lands with the tech and development world. And it's within that match that really innovation can happen, right? And that's what this partnership is all about. So there's acknowledgement that we need to end deforestation and restore lands in order to meet our climate crisis, our biodiversity crisis, and to produce better food systems globally. We need to tackle those two problems. And as Andrew mentioned, there's already commitment and momentum behind it for companies, investors, countries that make commitments around that to reduce this deforestation associated with production of commodities and to promote a global restoration movement. And some of those commitments older, but some brand new ones coming out of Glasgow just last week. But again, as Andrew said, all of that is nice and very important, but if we cannot measure what the outcomes of this process are, it's very hard for us to measure, to manage it, and to demonstrate progress towards those goals, right? I work for WRI. We're a global research organization that tries to turn ideas into action. And our motto is count it, change, and scale it. So that's really what this is about. We need to measure the size of the problem, work with partners, implementers on the ground to promote that change, and then really scale so it's not limited just to a small group. So our role here is we learned a little bit about this process. Maybe 7 years ago, we launched with Google a project that is called Global Forest Watch.
Yep.
For the first time, we could see at a global level where trees were disappearing on a 30 by 30 meter resolution using, again, technology. And we're ready and said, well, this is going to solve deforestation problems, right? But that was not really the case. I mean, we have made a lot of advancements, but we learned two lessons within that process. One is that data is an enabler, but people and institutions are the ones that make the change, right? So just providing the data is not enough. We need to bring people and institutions on board. And we learned that best or worst data is not a concept that exists. It's a best or worst data for a specific problem statement of a specific actor. So this was the first lesson. The second one is that we can do these global monitoring exercises, but we know that there is always going to be some localized and contextual data that is very important to achieving those goals. And one quick example is we had deforestation data and we wanted to apply that in the context of palm oil. But if we did not know where the palm oil mills were, we could not use that data. So we had to do an effort in trying to create a global palm oil list. So that's the other key lesson. We need to have contextual localized data. So that is what the Forest Data Partnership is all about. It's really tackling those two complementary problems, how to involve people into the decision-making, and how we tackle those global localized data for specific problem statements of implementers. And that's why Google, WRI, FAO, Unilever, NASA are all together in this, because we need all of those different stakeholders to really implement that.
Yeah, I can attest to this. I was at Glasgow and I was sitting next to an asset manager, one of the 30 that has actually signed the deforestation pledge. So, for those listening, deforestation commitments are not just with CPGs or retail, they're also affecting where capital goes. And she said, laughing, well, I was congratulating her for being one of the ones that signed the pledge. And she said, well, now we just have to measure and report on it. And so this is a widely acknowledged that, commitments are step zero, the follow-up and the execution, and having the body of people and institutions that support this common language and vocabulary on which you report is really something that the industry is hungry for. So with that, maybe we can go to who plays a really important role in doing some of this, bringing together ecosystems. Julian, I'll pass it to you. Do governments have a role to play in helping ensure deforestation-free supply chain, in your opinion? And what do you think is their responsibility? How do you use technology to help achieve those kinds of goals?
Thanks so much, Nithya. Really great to be here. I mean, I would say an FAO is an intergovernmental agency of the United Nations. So, of course, I'm going to say that governments have a central role, but they do. I mean, they're basically in the driving seat at this. I mean, we're talking about in their territories. So both the governments of producer countries, from where the forest risk commodities are sourced, and the governments of consumer countries, I think, have responsibilities here. I mean, in terms of the producer countries, as I said, they're responsible for the governance of their country. So they need to be a key stakeholder at the table. In fact, we see a lot of momentum for removing deforestation from supply chains, from consumer countries and the private sector, which is really wonderful. Many consumer countries have begun to identify actions to mitigate the consequences of their food consumption, such as import regulations, awareness raising, which is really great. However, producer countries are faced with an additional complexity as they need to reduce commodity-driven deforestation in the context of their sustainable development, ensuring food security without putting rural livelihoods at risk. So I'd say for them, it's a bit more complicated, and we really need to support the producer countries in this transition. Definitely technical and financial support is needed to allow them to proactively participate in global initiatives and respond to present and future regulations and due diligence systems. And we need to work in partnership with the producer countries to address the causes of commodity-driven deforestation and present a viable alternative, such as promoting sustainable forest management. So how does the Forest Data Partnership contribute to this? I think technology has a key role here. I mean, improving access to geospatial data, tools, platforms can support this process in several dimensions. And there's a clear role for the Forest Data Partnership here, so it's super exciting. I mean, in the last 10 years, we've seen huge advances in the quality of forest data for tropical forest countries, the producer countries. A lot of this has been driven by REDD+. We've seen Global Forest Watch, my organization, FAO, USAID, NASA, Sevilla, have had big capacity development programs for the tropical countries, which has been really powerful. And in parallel to that, we've seen the platforms develop, right? The geospatial architectures, which has culminated in Google Earth Engine now. Yeah. Even from my own organization, 10 years ago, we started working on open source solutions called Open Forests. And 5 years ago, we signed an MOU with Google, and that really helped us advance some of the tools in Open Forest, such as Collect Earth Online, and Sepal, which is a platform that we just launched a second phase of in an earlier session earlier tonight, which is really great. But all these tools allow the producer countries to create their own geospatial data, and that I think is really powerful. And a shout out to this community. I think, some of the work I think coming through this partnership, it's a great place to bring your algorithms, your technical solutions to the producer countries where they're really needed, right? So I think in the innovation phase, we'll talk about that in a moment. So, I mean, in addition, there's a really important need for capacity development and technology transfer to the producer countries. And here, I think my organization, USAID, NASA, Sevilla, WRI have a really key role in that sort of bottom-up capacity development. We need the producer countries to have access to the data, the tools, the platforms, the algorithms to basically create their own data and make really great decisions about the food production that's happening in their sovereign territory. So we're really excited to be a part of the Forest Data Partnership, and we see this as a pathway to enhancing the role of really transparent and publicly available geospatial data to tackle these, critical global challenges of reducing commodity-driven deforestation and catalyzing large-scale restoration. So back to you, Nithya. Thanks so much.
No, absolutely. And in fact, I was hoping you would talk a little bit about the landscape on the ground. What I'm hearing over and over that, at these pledges or talking about deforestation free, can sometimes sound like a blunt instrument where you're just saying deforestation free, but that's not a binary goal. You have a nuanced goal of actually securing smallholder farmers, livable wages, protecting their own biodiversity, but their well-being and health and all of that. So it's making sure that you don't have a lopsided pledge or the power dynamic between producers and consumers that ends up sort of going against what you set out to achieve. So I really appreciate that grounds up perspective. And in fact, Karis, I was going to ask you, you've been participating in Geo for Good. You're no stranger to us for years now. And you've seen evolutions both within our organizations as well as all of these external markets, commitments and demands. So I'd love to hear from you. What do you think has shifted? Because to Julian's point and many others before, Luiz as well made this point, commitments, this idea of looking at land surface change, knowing that deforestation is a huge problem. None of those are exactly new problem statements. So I'm curious, what do you think has shifted now versus earlier? And how much of it is technology versus policy? And what is the role that Sowrirajan plays here?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start with Sowrirajan. The thing I really appreciate about with Sowrirajan and then, even FAO, I think we all have kind of the same capacity building philosophy where it's needs driven, working with, different stakeholders. So whether it's a country or an investor needing to monitor their investments or a consortium of, local farmers. I feel like we have a landscape that we've already been hearing about all day and working with for a long time, where we have a lot of satellites in the sky, amazing, both temporal and spatial resolution of images you can process, really great data products like the dynamic world. You can slice and dice those in many different ways. So you can work with the raw imagery, you can work with all these great time series analysis, you can work with the products. And I feel like we have all these commitments, we have all the pieces to get there to, measure and monitor. But I feel like it's also a bit of information overload. So I feel like what's really great about this partnership and this initiative is it's not, here's some really great data, use it. It's kind of building with the ground up with those stakeholders. What do you need? What data is available? What are the gaps? What are the strengths of the data we work with? What are the limitations? Like a lot of companies I talk to, they like working with some, they'll work with one data set and they'll get criticized by different.
No, that does not happen.
The limitations of the data. It's not a good data set, right? Yeah. We know Earth observation data is fantastic. And there's also a lot of nuances to know all about those, how you use it, what you can say about it. And I feel like that's where people's eyes kind of roll over. You don't talk about that at the Thanksgiving dinner table, right? So I feel like having all those stakeholders on board and kind of working to simplify the communication, the standard operating procedures, what data do we have? What can we say about it? How can we improve it? And what are the gaps? And so I think that's what I most look forward to over, the next 5 years of working with the stakeholders and this amazing group of partners.
So what do you see specifically as a role of FDP that's going to exponentially improve what you just said? Because the work is not necessarily new, working with the stakeholders, making sure that the data is actually contextualized to the local context and the market and their needs. So what do you think FDP will bring to the table that will really maybe make this even like 10x bigger and faster? Because we need it. We're running out of time.
Yeah. I feel like that's the most challenging part, is just building that consensus. And so, it's easy to say what's going to be the biggest impact from this. I think it's also going to be the most challenging is identifying how do we build a consensus? How do we get all these different voices heard? And kind of moving towards a shared vision, and then make sure that all of this information that we have is available to be communicated well and understood well. So I think our challenge and our impact are both pretty. Maybe along those same lines, I'll ask a similar question to you, Andrew.
Lots of companies and supply chain companies in particular have been talking about zero deforestation, NDP, no degradation of peatlands, no human exploitation for a long time. So again, those topics are not new. And some deadlines, unfortunately, have come and gone. So tell me what you see differently this time, both from a market and industry landscape. And then again, the same question to you on what is the promise you see of FDP to change that rhetoric a little bit this time around?
Yeah. So I think, we've all seen over kind of the last 10 years that certification alone won't be able to guarantee deforestation-free supply chain, whether it's Roundtable on sustainable palm oil or what have you. And so what we've concluded is that to really drive deforestation out of the supply chain, we need kind of transparency and understanding of the origins that constitute the supply chain, going beyond the mill and getting into that kind of critical first mile. So how materials are flowing at that first entry point into the supply chain. And so it's not just understanding that first mile, it's also understanding that, the people that are making a billion different decisions every day in that first mile. And in particular, I think how that relates to then the participants in the supply chain. And so really, I think what this comes down to is the story of, and this is getting into what's different this time. I don't think it's necessarily the machine learning. I don't think it's the proliferation of satellites. I don't think it's the hyperscale of the cloud, although those are all going to help. It's how participatory it makes the whole thing. How easy it is to share a data set that's gigantic, petabytes, or with a single line of code. The ability to develop apps and UI. And so I think it's by participation that we're going to kind of demystify the whole thing, because it's easy to get really caught up and trapped up in all the kind of tech buzzwords. We sometimes call it tech soup. But really, it's about demystifying it and making it accessible, because it's not just Unilever's commitment. It's then all the commitments of the businesses and communities that constitute our supply chains. And so that ranges from multinational companies that produce and trade these commodities, but it also includes village level communities where we've got jurisdictional projects in the island of Borneo, Sumatra. We have projects in West Africa. And so that's to me what's different this time. And I think that's what's really exciting about FDP here, is that I know all of our partners here have this kind of built into their DNA, working with stakeholders, listening, and integrating all that into kind of an action plan.
Luiz, I saw you doing some knowing nods and smiles while Andrew was talking. Do you want to elaborate?
Yeah, no, Andrew was spot on, right? The question, what is new here? It's the innovation is really not the tech and the data necessarily, right? That's, as Andrew said, that's going to have, what is the innovation?
It just warms my heart, just so you know, as Google, but keep going.
Well, it's a potential is there, but sometimes the bottlenecks are unexpected places, right? And that's what we were discussing here, is that we learned through those past half a decade that sometimes the bottleneck is not the tech, is how we create those bridges between the tech and the implementers, and how we align on the understanding of the implementers. So as it was said before, they don't fight over which is the best data or the worst data. There's alignment. Well, a quick anecdote. I moved to WRI 5 years ago. I was, before coming, I'm Brazilian. I was coming from the finance sector. And when we had Global Forest Watch, it was this innovation in WRI on monitoring all of the deforestation globally. But Brazil had an official monitoring system called PRODIS that had been working for 20 years. So we're kind of used to it. The first thing I did when I got to WRI was, so which one is better? PRODIS or the UMD data, right? And folks were, it's complicated. And I was like, no, you have to, which one is better, right? And so I actually figured out, well, it depends on the question that you're asking, right? So one is better for maybe for compliance, the other is better for more near real-time monitoring. So again, matching that problem statement with the best available technology and data, that's what is one of the key innovations here. The second one is creating trust on that system. That's why it's so important to have FAO and NASA and Google and this multi-stakeholder approach, because that's what it will make tech folks trust because they see Google in, governments trust because they see FAO in, civil society folks trust because they see WRI in, right? And then the final innovation is about process, right? It's how we get there. So it's a boring bureaucratic thing, but to get alignment, it's all about establishing a process for decision making. And that's why our project is aligned within this process of first phase is let's align with the stakeholders. What are their problem statements? Let's ask them. Let's then bring the tech and the scientists to innovate and say, what is the best solution for that specific problem statement? And here's the call of action for folks watching this. We'll get there and actually throw at you a bunches of requests on this is what we need, help us out. Once we do that, then we go to the deploy phase, which is going back to the implementers and say, here it is, deploy it at your policy, deploy it at your local monitoring system, deploy it at your company global monitoring system. And finally is assess. We want to then do studies on testing what is the impact of all of this work. We're doing that for impact. So we, at the end, need to know actually what was the result of all of that work. So this alignment, innovate, deploy, and assess, that's the process that is new and that hopefully is going to get us over this bottleneck.
That's great. This really reminded me of an analogy. And I used to be in ads, which you might have heard of as the bread and butter of Google. And I sold to Andrew's company. I love being on this side, by the way, Andrew, much better to work with you in this way. And the biggest thing in the reason I'm bringing up this analogy, as wonky as it might seem, is with the advent of digital media, there were no common standards. And often what happened is there was a lack of trust in the industry from our advertiser buying community that said, well, Facebook says this is what a video ad effectiveness means, and this is what YouTube says, and this is what Pinterest says. And there was really a lack of industry standards. And there's a Media Ratings Council that has stepped in. And to your point, Luiz, some very snooze-worthy conversations about standards and how to measure them and how to certify them. And, they have an auditing company that comes in and says, okay, everybody's measuring by the same standards. I'm hearing a lot of whenever you have the advent of new technology that's being used, by itself, it doesn't solve the problem. That technology needs to be understood in a vocabulary and a language that everybody can agree on. Of course, allow for customization, allow for nuance. But if you're constantly arguing about definitions and whether the data in itself is accurate or trustworthy, then you're never getting to the point of, okay, now let's deploy it, let's report on it, let's action on it. So I am very optimistic that FTP creates this trust, like you said. So this might be a completely self-serving question, and Karis, maybe for you. It is obviously, although I'm moderating, Google is also a front row seat partner on FTP. So how do you see and intend to leverage Earth Engine and cloud technology? Obviously, we're very excited, but given your Earth Engine work in the past and tying that to what you see is best, and frankly, even maybe being tough on us and saying, what do we really need to show up with to make us really a valuable contributor to FTP?
Yeah. I think a lot of the things everybody's probably thinking at the same time is, we have great access to data through Google Earth Engine. We have a library of processing algorithms that make it easy to use. And it's really easy to collaborate, share scripts. It's easy to share data, build quick apps. So I feel like that's the groundwork that's really important. There's two new things that are, coming or kind of already here that I think are also going to be valuable. One is just like most of us are probably working with Google Earth Engine and the Google tools for free. So, as long as you're doing good with academia or nonprofits, you can innovate and you can use all these tools. A lot of the companies we work with or the governments we work with are always a bit skeptical of investing in this tech when they know there's a little bit of uncertainty that this will always be free. What is it going to look like in the future? So I think, especially with this, it's also nice knowing that there's now, more of a push moving into accessing Google Earth Engine and the computing power with the commercial license. So I think that's one thing that's powerful, but it still is really easy to collaborate between kind of this academic R&D group, also with the commercial group. So those are some things I can see. But I'm curious to hear from others on the panel too.
Yeah, I was going to toss it to Julian. How do you and FAO in general, Julian, engage in these kinds of efforts, and especially when you think about Google and technology? What do you think is different about this collaboration? And also just being honest maybe about what gives you hope, but what are going to be our challenges and our roadblocks, given that we're just at the inception of this, but we should be prepared to know what our pitfalls might be.
Yeah, thanks, Nithya. I think the other panelists summed it up really well. I mean, next year, this group and the most important stakeholders involved in both the reducing deforestation from commodities and restoration, we're going to work on this alignment, right? And I think that is critical. I think we're all super excited. I think most of us here and everybody listening are techie type people, but we really need to reach some consensus amongst a pretty complicated set of stakeholders involved in these two pressing global issues, and coming to some agreement on the key problem statements. I mean, what is the key problem statement to really reduce deforestation, commodity-driven deforestation? What is the key problem statement to unleash the potential of large-scale forest and landscape restoration? And we need to have that alignment between the people here. I mean, one really novel thing about this partnership is that we have the private sector. We have an intergovernmental agency, my agency. We have one of the world's leading NGOs in WRI. We have Google, and we have NASA. So it's a pretty amazing group of partners already. And then we bring in some other key stakeholders at the country level, at other private sector actors, and we really build that consensus and on the key problem statements. And then after that, well, we can unleash the innovation, right? And that is the exciting part. And I think that's where this community will come to the front. I mean, as FAO, we do a lot of multi-stakeholder engagement. So, I mean, it's not that it's very necessary, but it can be a tough road, but it's really critical, I think. And what I'm hearing from the other panelists and what we've learned over the years is you really need that consensus before you can jump into the machine learning and start deploying data sets. So I think the alignment. I think next year we've got our work cut out, and it's going to be difficult, but we're all here at this table, and I think we can work through it. So I'm very positive.
Great. Shifting from technology to people, Luiz, maybe I'll throw this to you, but I'm happy to hear from anyone, since so many of you have real hands-on experience yourselves, or those that you work with on the ground. How are you thinking about, we talked a lot about putting the data in the hands of the producer countries. How will FDP make an impact with respect to areas that are poverty-stricken, or just frankly, I mean, the big debate in Glasgow and many others is this constant need to balance economic growth, which comes from energy security and ability to have natural resources, with fighting climate action. So maybe you can talk a little bit about this very human element of how are we ensuring that people on the ground have the resources they need, have the means to productive lives for them and their families, while FDP strives to continue to move towards these goals?
Yeah, I think that's a great and fantastic question, and it's something that we need to keep, as Julian was saying as well, very close to the core mission of this, right? And again, the key way to tackle that is those folks need to be at the table, right? I spent my life actually working with farmers and landholders and landowners. I used to joke that I was working in the bank, but my work was going through the farmers. I used to joke that I would be more respected when I had cow dung on my shoes than if I was wearing a suit, because that was what it was all about, right? Is going out there and trying to understand those needs. So we need not them, but then the indigenous groups and the local communities in this discussion, so they can bring also those potential unintended consequences. They can bring something potentially coming from the left field that we didn't see before on a new data that can potentially really raise the potential for them to also differentiate themselves, or also profit more from this movement of transforming commodities, which were products that were traditionally produced exactly the same way, traded globally at the global prices. And now what we see is a differentiation of that products based on the way they're produced. And that's actually a good thing, right? Because you can say, my product is more sustainable and it's better. I want to show it off because then I'm differentiating myself from the rest of the bulk of the commodities. This process is not going to happen if that doesn't happen. And producers and local communities are not going to benefit from it if they cannot demonstrate that theirs is not a commodity. There's something slightly different. So this decommoditization process is something that I have as an assumption that could help those local communities, but they need to be on the table to actually bring that and make the case for themselves, or bring something else that I don't know what it is.
Right. I was reading a report that for many CPG companies, sustainably marketed products are more than 50% of the revenue growth. So it's really showing that consumer preference is changing. And I'm really hoping that that is the flywheel, the ecosystem that you're talking about, Luiz, that is convincing, of course, the ones that are sourcing, but then gives incentives to, it's always looked at as a tax to produce things sustainably. And if we can reverse that as an incentive, not a tax or a cost, that's really the holy grail. Andrew, speaking of, yeah, go ahead.
And it's not just differentiating to say, oh, it's a premium thing. It's also excluding the ones that are doing the bad thing, right? Or because they're actually having an impact on the world. If you're bringing illegal production into supply chains, that is depreciating the price. That is actually causing bad for the rest of the producers. They're competing with something legal. It's like, well, how can you compete with somebody that is not following the law, right? So even that type of differentiation, if you can just start showing legality vis-a-vis legality, it's not really rocket science. It's not really a big differentiation of a niche product, but that also is something that can benefit local producers that are doing the right thing.
Makes sense. So the right rewards and penalties that really help consumers differentiate between things. Andrew, what if you could wave a magic wand that every supply chain procurement manager up and down the chain at Unilever could see a magical dashboard that really gave you the data and the metrics at your fingertips? What do you think you would fast forward to looking at, and that FDP could be a key contributor of? And maybe, obviously I'm familiar because we work so closely with you. It might even be useful to say that you're innovating right this second, so it's not just aspirational. What tools do you use today, and how do you anticipate them getting even better with this?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I mean, you probably don't need a magic wand. We can just log into the tool we've built, and using Earth Engine at the core of it. But what I would do with this magic wand is maybe make that tool available to lots of other stakeholders, or a version of the tool that suits their needs. Again, I think one of the driving points of consensus of our partners here is that it really doesn't matter how exactly you're counting the pixels, so long as you're doing the same thing. And so really that's really the crux of it, is how do you get as much alignment around the usage and kind of the deployment of these data. And I think that's a decent segue from I think part of our partnership is not just on the usage, it's also how the data are produced, and that be participatory and inclusive, and leverage local communities to generate the data that train things like the models. And I think that's especially true. We've been talking a lot about deforestation, but half this partnership is about restoration, and half is kind of who's going to get into splitting hairs there. But that's a huge area where inclusive behavior, inclusive data generation, and innovation is going to be just huge. Understanding where restoration has the greatest impact, and then being able to say something about that impact, because that's ultimately what's going to drive the incentive structure for smallholder farmers, like you were mentioning, being talked about at Glasgow.
Makes sense. I'm told that we have some audience questions, so I'm going to jump into those, if that's okay. Luiz, the first one is for you. It's from Rachel F. And she's asking a question about Global Forest Watch. It's a great product for tropical forests. However, she says many other types of forests play an important role in carbon and biodiversity, and those have false positives or don't pick up clearing in GFW. It's a hard job to detect clearing across diverse landscapes accurately. So I don't expect a miracle product, but is there any talk of improving this auto change loss detection accuracy outside the tropics and GFW?
Thanks, Rachel. Well, that's a great question. And again, a perfect example of what is the best data for a specific problem statement, right? You have a very specific problem statement, and that's defining that there are some issues that needs to be tackled for that specific problem statement that you have. And just, it's something that we have heard a lot, right? So I think, again, one of the things is trying to, we have been trying to improve some of those data for that specific type of problem statement. So I think we'd be happy to know that we've launched, again, another initiative in Glasgow, which is a sister one to this Forest Data Partnership, which is called Land and Carbon Lab. Land and Carbon Lab, it's, if I could summarize in one line, it's GFW for all land-related changes, right? And again, together with Google as a partner, whose goal is really try to tackle the specific problem that you're saying, right? Can we identify not only where trees are disappearing, but what is substituting? What are the different types of trees? What are the different types of forests? Because not all forests are created equal, as they're saying. The same way, not all of trees planted or plantations are created equal, or not all agricultural production is created equal. So that's the vision of this Land and Carbon Lab initiative, is GFW for all land use changes. So I encourage you to visit the site and see there's already some cool new data sets there that maybe will solve your problem statement, maybe will not, and then we'll try to tackle it later.
Sounds good. Karis, I have a feeling you might have something to add here. Anything to add on this one?
No, I'll turn it back.
Okay. No problem. Andrew, the next question is to you. It's a little long, but I'm going to try and, there's still more questions coming. Okay. So Jyoti S says, reaching standardization and definitions is a long and arduous process. I think we all agree. Nobody's disagreeing with that. So how does this roundtable think about incentivizing participation in communities to move to directionally correct measures? Would Unilever, for instance, want to fund some projects that address portions of your supply chains? It may not be perfect, but may start cultivating trust by establishing programs that take us in the right direction. If I'm reading this correctly, I think she's paraphrasing and agreeing that you all believe that having community participation ground up is really important, but it might take time. So are there ways, and as a private sector with some remit and capital, is that one of the ways that you could incentivize and move things faster?
Yeah, definitely. So, I hear two questions here. And the first, around the long and arduous process, is no one's implying that we wait until it's done to do anything. We've built what we feel is a decent data ecosystem through direct partnerships, with Google, with Descartes Labs, Orbital Insight, NGIS, Earth Equalizer, among many others, on the phone frequently with different research groups that are producing good data. Even just today, I saw a new Palm data set available in Earth Engine that was published in Nature. And so no one's talking about waiting, and we're driving the change, and we're working directly with our suppliers based on the understanding that we feel we've managed to get from use of this tool, this platform, and these data sets. In parallel, we'll do the arduous work of alignment and getting full collective action. To the point about ready to fund the projects, we've been ready for years now. We have 5 jurisdictional projects in Southeast Asia alone, where we engage in landscapes in Sabah, Malaysia, Central Kalimantan. There's a great piece just put out on our partnership with Yayasan Inobu in Central Kalimantan, Siak Palalawan, North Sumatra, and Aceh. So, not just name dropping geographies here, but I think the important thing is we're also not just focused on our supply chain and the palm oil that we buy. There's also acacia plantations and rubber plantations and cassava for subsistence agriculture. And these jurisdictional projects that we've been supporting for many years now don't try to view landscapes as like a palm production unit. These landscapes are where people live, go to school, get married, build houses, so on and so forth. And that's really what we're trying to do, is be as holistic as possible when we engage like that with as many of the stakeholders that kind of share our vision there.
That's great. We just have a little bit of time left, and I don't want to exit this thinking that this is the only group, because I think the big part, the amazing part we'd like to think about the Geo for Good community is that you have a whole set of engaged developers, academics, scientists, researchers, and NGOs that are listening in the audience or going to watch the recording later, and they have a role to play. Right? There's some of them are actually collecting these data sets, and perhaps this is the first time they're connecting the dots on, this science will get operationalized on the ground and will be used in XYZ way. So I would love to pass it to all of you, if you don't mind, to close it out, to say, and go in whatever order you like. What call to action would you have to this community that's listening and that's so dedicated to making Google Earth Engine as a really valuable resource?
I'll maybe start.
Yeah, please.
And I was kind of thinking about this with the last two questions a little bit, is we want to start with action now. We have a lot of great data sets. They're giving us numbers. They're probably giving us different numbers. If you work with like a really fine spatial resolution, your biomass estimates are going to be different than if you're working with a 1 kilometer spatial resolution. So I think we have so many great minds listening right now. One thing that I think is so important is, how do we effectively communicate uncertainty? We know how to give those numbers. We know how to give, plus or minus this amount. I think innovation and just like how we clearly and simply communicate those uncertainties. So when governments are faced with, I have one number here and one number here, which one is right? Which one is the best? How do we start, making more useful information out of both numbers?
Great. Just keep going.
Yeah, I think Nithya, call to action is spot on, and I think Karis, like translating some of the really complex and technical concepts that are inherent to remote sensing into things that are accessible to decision makers are both huge. But for me, it is really that call to action, and I think it's then incumbent on the FDP to put forward addressable challenges, winnable challenges to this community. Up until now, we've basically been benefiting from, the partnerships that the Geo for Good community has forged, Map Biomas, Dynamic World, what have you. Anytime we see a good data set, we try and pull it in and see, does it relate to our business? And I think, what we're, going to ask the community to stay tuned for is for more pointed, challenges to rise to the occasion based on that alignment process that's so critical that Luiz and Julian were describing. So that's for me kind of it in a nutshell.
To me, I think I have two calls to action. One I already kind of gave a hint is kind of watch this space, because I think one of the key things that we want to do here is really bring those words together, right? Impact really happens on this innovation, and our job is going to try to serve as the translator between the tech world and the implementer world. And sometimes it's hard to bring those folks to discuss together, right? So this is the first one, watch this space, because I hope that it will be a very strong guidance on where we think the impact will be the largest, and for all of us here, really all about impact, right? So I think this is the first one, and make an effort on that, trying to understand the jargons from the other side as well, right? And the second one is a little bit of a provocation. I know, like on tech and research, sometimes we're really thinking about making the perfect research product or the perfect products. Remember that for impact and for that application on its day-to-day, operationalization is sometimes as important as the perfect data set, right? So is it really a scalable one, even if the error margin is still more or less not fully tackled with? Again, as long as it's transparent and know those uncertainties, sometimes there's a use for that, right? As long as we know that. Remember, there's not good or bad data. There's good or bad data for a specific problem statement. So maybe that data that is not perfect yet actually serves very well one problem statement. So yeah, good sometimes, good and not perfect sometimes is good enough within this application process.
Yeah, if I could just piggyback on that, as a supply chain, we could drive tremendous change with a p-value of 0.1 or 0.2, just to translate it for all our researcher friends in the community.
So progress, not perfection. Yeah. Julian?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other panelists have summed it up really well, but just encourage the community to keep innovating. Don't be scared to fail. I mean, as everybody here says, there's no perfect data set. I think all data sets are valued. So share your algorithms, please make them open and transparent through Google Earth Engine, through other platforms, through our platform, through WRI platforms. Make them publicly available, because somebody for some problem statement somewhere will find them extremely useful. So keep innovating, and in parallel, we'll start aligning, and we'll get back to you.
Excellent. Awesome. Well, it's really been a wonderful roundtable. I'm so delighted to be bringing all of our platforms, ecosystem technologies together for FDP, the Forest Data Partnership. I know we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but I'm excited to have a much more sustainable commodity supply chain through this collaboration. So thank you to all our speakers for your time in all your various time zones. It really shows your dedication to this vision. Thank you to our virtual audience for your questions and for joining us today. Adieu for good.